All right, it's now my great honor and my deep personal privilege to introduce this year's Gina Guy Keynote for Government Service, our speaker, Governor Dave Freudenthal. This keynote recognizes legal professionals who have devoted their career to strengthening government, using their training, judgment, and sometimes sheer grit to make it work better for the communities they serve. Governor Freudenthal embodies this spirit. He began his professional career as a staff economist in the Department of Economic Development and Planning. After earning his law degree from the University of Wyoming College of Law, he entered private practice in Cheyenne, focusing on energy and natural resource law. He then served as the state planning coordinator under Governor Hirschler, confronting economic and resource challenges deeply tied to Wyoming's future. In 1994, he was appointed U.S. Attorney for the District of Wyoming. He was then elected as Wyoming's 31st governor, serving from 2003 to 2011. And he helped shape the state into what we know today, from energy and natural resource policy to how government interacts with its citizens. Following his time as governor, he returned to the legal practice, continuing to contribute to Wyoming and national discussions on energy, environment, and natural resources policy. In 2022, he published The Paradox of Plenty, steering Wyoming through boom and bust cycles of energy dependence, which offers a candid and insightful look at the challenges and opportunities that come with governing a state so deeply tied to natural resource development. It's a must-read for anybody who's interested in understanding Wyoming's past and its future. Throughout his career, he's been recognized for his thoughtful leadership, pragmatic problem solving, and deep commitment to Wyoming's people and landscapes. His approach to governing reflects exactly what this keynote celebrates. That government service done well is both a skill and a purpose. I had the privilege of working for Governor Freudenthal during his time in office. He took a chance on a 21-year-old kid out of the Forest Service, still wearing what he affectionately calls my waffle boots. The opportunity set the course for my career and honestly, my life, because Dave opened doors and showed me what public service looks like at its very best. Anyone who's worked for Dave will tell you it's both an honor and a humbling experience. You could spend weeks putting together a detailed briefing and deliver it to him, only to realize he already knew all of it and more. Or you could spend days drafting the perfect speech, carefully balancing policy and humor and timing, only to have him quickly glance at it on the way to an event, set it aside, and then give the most engaging remarks completely off the cuff. So we learned to celebrate small victories. Did he use a single line that we wrote? Success. Did he make a joke about not using your remarks? Even better. He also helped launch this very energy law and policy conference back in 2013 and served as the master of ceremonies for many years. When he was at the microphone, you could count on wit, wisdom, and perfect timing. So it's a real pleasure to have him back with us today to give the Gina Guy keynote on government service. Governor Matt Mead said it best when he said, Governor Freudenthal is one of Wyoming's brightest political minds. He doesn't just have brilliance in the art of politics, but even more important, for decades he has used his considerable political talent to serve his unshakable desire to help Wyoming and her citizens. Please help me in welcoming Governor Dave Freudenthal.
Well, Temple, I have stories I could tell, but I won't. But I thank you for that glowing introduction, but it doesn't seem to fit me, but I'll take it. So I'm supposed to talk about public service in the context of the person for whom this keynote is named. And Gina Guy is an interesting example of somebody who early on did two things. One, she chose public service as the direction she wanted to go, volunteering early for the Women's Army Corps, which, while it's called the Women's Army Corps, it was run by men. And she was active there and then eventually went to law school. Graduated in 1975. There were 3 women in her graduating class. I think there were 7 when I graduated in 1980. The last time I spoke at the law school, it's either pretty even or there are more women than men entering the law profession. She continued her path of public service, working for the Department of Interior for an extended period, including a stint as solicitor down in, a regional solicitor down in Denver for the Department of Interior, which is where I met her. And I represented largely drillers and diggers, and we weren't all that fond of the solicitor's office. So there was occasion for us to have meetings. And I will tell you, she was remarkably professional. She was prepared, she was competent, and she was pretty firm in her positions, which I think is a reflection of her life. After a while of doing that, she eventually went and changed gears entirely, went to DC and worked for the Air Force. Was, I think, a 3-star general, which is the way they deal with their lawyers so they can pay them some. And she did that for a couple of years, came back to Wyoming, and many of you may have met her at these gatherings or others before she passed. The point being that she made that choice, but she made that choice in the context of having the willingness to take the risk to do different opportunities that come along in the context of public service, particularly government service. Now, government service is not the place you're going to get rich. But I had an old friend of mine who worked for the state for a long time, lived with the salaries and all the headaches that go with it, and assured me that the psychic income of public service more than offset the monetary income that he had to forego. I would encourage you to think about public service, and this is going to irritate Temple, but what the hell, I've done that before. Think about public service as more than just government service. Government service is really a great opportunity, particularly if you want to get backgrounded in certain kinds of, sort of basics. And remember, even if you're not a lawyer, the problem with our lives as we go through life is we get better and better at a more narrow field of things. You discover pretty soon that you're an expert in X, Y, or Z, and that becomes the self-definition. But it's a limiting definition and says to you that I'm really good at this, though I don't know if I want to take the risk of trying to do something different. In the context of government, you can move from agency to agency, as she did, largely dealing. Remember, that was a period where NEPA, Endangered Species Act, Migratory Bird, all of those things were evolving in terms of their legal implications. But she took that knowledge and applied it at various places in Interior and also at the Air Force. Same issues, but very different kind of work. The problem with, and it's not just lawyers. I have friends who are engineers, and they're incredibly good water engineers, but that's all they know. And in some ways, it comes about because the more you know about a narrow subject, if they need you, the more they pay you. The problem is that you end up at the end of your career looking back and saying, well, I guess I know a lot about Endangered Species Act or mineral leasing or water swaps, but there's a lot of stuff you didn't get a chance to work on. So think about government service as an opportunity, but think about service, public service, more broadly. And I say that in part based on my own experience. I mean, I started out practicing by myself, just hung up my shingle, and I will tell you the first 3 years were a little challenging. First of all, you have to learn which client's actually going to pay, and that, you write off a lot of time. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. But once I've sort of got established, I did a number of things that allowed me to see other parts of the Cheyenne community, other parts of the state, and to get a texture in my life that I wouldn't have had if I simply sat behind my desk and dealt with whatever came in. I sat on a church vestry. If you wanna get some bizarre politics, go to your church and get on the vestry. People, they'll have a decision, and it all starts with, I prayed and God told me this is what we should do. Now that gets a little tricky when you're trying to evaluate various bids for installing the sprinkler system in the church. But uh, as God is my witness, that was part of the experience. But it was a fascinating experience in that you learned a lot of things about how people see things differently than you do. I spent time with the Chamber of Commerce. I served on the Laramie County Community Action Board and frankly learned how much sort of poverty and disadvantage there is in the state, something you don't see or hear about. And so think about it not just as government service, but in a broader sense, public service. And you have to understand that, particularly when you're young and you're trying to raise a family and you got all of those obligations and stuff, your time gets limited. So you want to be careful about what you pick to make sure that you can participate fully and not feel like you've, not taken your kids to the choir practice or, I mean, it's just sort of, we went through that. We had 4 kids. And most of the time we felt like we were running a cab service. But we fit in things that allowed both Nancy and I to see other parts of the community. Then I was fortunate enough to get on a couple of state agency boards, which allows you then to see parts of the state and to hear about problems that you won't encounter in your daily life as a lawyer. So my argument to you about public service, whether it's governmental service, which I happen to think is really important, and I've spent a lot of my life at it. I figure I spent about a little more than half of my life in private practice and a little less than half in public life. And when you think about this notion of public service, it includes more than just working for the government. And I would encourage you, if you get a chance, take a sabbatical or take whatever time you can from your law firm and explore how the government works. Because both the federal government, which I've worked in, and state government, which I've worked in, they have different, they're like all groups. They eventually get a kind of ethos or pathos that works inside of that operation. And then when you go back out in private practice, it's a lot easier to understand how to go into a meeting with an agency and what it is they're looking for. Something that you don't get if you just go into the meeting because you've not sat on that side of the desk. It's really valuable to sit on the other side of the desk when you're trying to solve a problem for a client. And as you know, there are good clients and there are bad clients, and they both pay, but there are clients who listen, and there are clients who already knew the answer before they came in your office, and they really, they want to say they hired a lawyer, but they really aren't going to change anything they're doing. And after a while, we don't necessarily fire clients, but we sort of indicate that perhaps we're no longer valuable and you move on to something where you feel like you're productive. And I would argue that you will be more productive in your profession, no matter what it is, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a lawyer, whether you're a priest or whatever you choose. I would argue that you're going to be better at that core if you make yourself go out and have other experiences. Go out and get to know the community, get to know the state. I mean, I learned a lot. I was on an economic development board, a couple of predecessors back from the Business Council. And it was fascinating to me to go into a lot of small towns in Wyoming and discover their perspective and how it is they see things, particularly how they saw things going on in Cheyenne or the courthouse and what it is. Part of what you learn is most people's only interaction with the courts is a speeding ticket or maybe something in, small claims court. Very few people get embroiled in extended litigation. Those who do don't necessarily have the most positive attitude about lawyers, even their own, but certainly about the lawyers on the other side. And you don't get that if you don't broaden out in some form to understand it. And I think the best thing is public service. If you get a shot at working for the government for a while, doesn't pay well. I bet you get by. But what you really have is the ability to understand how the government looks at issues. If you're a regulator, you look at it entirely differently than the regulated community. You can go in on behalf of a client into the regulated community, into that agency, and you can have that dialogue, but you really don't understand what it is that's going on in the back of their mind unless you've been there. and it's worth it in terms of your professional development. Then you'll say, well, it doesn't pay very well. Well, you know, that old business about, you know, you don't take your money with you in your coffin is true. And so what you do take is the people you've loved and people you've touched and the things that you've done, and that matters. And I would argue to you that the extent the law profession has become fundamentally money driven, it's off track. I mean, if you look at some historical figures, particularly somebody like Lincoln, he didn't exactly get rich, but he had an incredibly rich life long before he got in the White House. A life that had victories, had defeats, had good things, had bad things, but it was a life that had the texture of being human. So my argument to you is, think about public service. I highly recommend government service, both at the state and federal level. I've done some appearances in front of city councils and things like that, and that too is very different. They're more managed by codes than they are by sort of the traditional CFR or the state rules and regulations. It's a different insight. And then when you're dealing with a citizen council who are elected, is different than dealing with somebody like the Industrial Siting Council or the DEQ Council who are appointed. It's just a different sense, and a different sense that allows you to come away thinking, yeah, there's a lot of ways to skin a cat. And some of them work in the state government, some of them work in federal government, and some of them work at the local level, but they're not quite the same. They're just, you know, you're in a different venue. And I can't tell you how much richer your life will feel if you take advantage of that. And of course, you know, you're going to get into a firm and you want to be a partner and all that. And I'm not saying that's unimportant, but at the end of the day, you'll eventually get to be a partner. The question is whether you're a partner in a cubicle or whether you're a partner who has tentacles out around the community that you want to work in. So I'd encourage that. I know I've strayed Temple from just government service, but there are lots of ways to serve. And there's the last benefit you get from it is sometimes you just feel better. You know, I got engaged in X, Y, or Z, and I feel like I did the right thing, and maybe we did a little good, or at least more good than we did bad. And that's not a bad feeling to go to sleep with. And it's certainly a lot more fun than to go to sleep with that than worrying about whether you got a brief written or whether you misdrafted a memo to go to some other partner or whether you miss some detail. And you know, it's its own reward to do some form of public service, be it government service at any level, or whether it be, you know, get the mayor to appoint you to something or somebody else to appoint you to something, or just volunteer with some group, whether it's a theater group or whether it's something that forces you out of the self-definition that we all adopt because we've chosen a career. We've gotten really good at some aspect of that career, and that's not as rewarding as sort of taking the risk. And that's the thing about Gina Guy. She took the risk. If you look at her resume, she moved within the government circles in a variety of roles, in a variety of ways, which caused her to have, every time I was around her, she seemed to have a rich and happy life. And I think that part of it was that she understood that, you know, you don't want to be a cubicle person who knows a lot about one thing and nothing about the world. So take advantage of it. Okay, so if you got questions, I'll be glad to answer, but she's pointing at her watch, which says, you know, shut up and sit down. So am I done? I'll take them from anybody but you.
Governor, I'm Carol Frost, retired from UW. I just wondered, looking back on your busy life, if you, in retrospect, saw opportunities or now would see opportunities you didn't have the chance to take but would recommend.
Well, what I'd say is that any notion that I had a master plan is incorrect. You know, only a fool runs as a Democrat for governor in Wyoming. So, but I did it anyway. So I would argue that your assessment of the opportunities in front of you tend to emphasize the risk, because as human beings, we're risk averse. And so we emphasize the risk and we say, well, I can't do that. I don't know anything about it. You know, when I joined the chamber board, was elected at the chamber board and eventually became president, I was nervous about it because I knew a lot about, you know, drillers, diggers, and regulators, but not as much as I should have known about the business community in Cheyenne. But it was a great education, great opportunity, met great people, you know, some of whom I agreed with, some of whom I didn't agree with. But hell, Nancy and I don't agree all the time. Surprising how often my wife is wrong. But I would say, look at what comes by. Some of it you have to go after. You know, you got to put your name in for an appointment, or, you know, get to know the mayor, get to know somebody and see if you can make that work. An agency head who, you'll be surprised how much input agency heads have on who's on their advisory boards. Simply because they tend to know people who know that area of expertise. And, you know, you'll look at it and say, well, that's going to take too much time, or it's going to do this. And it will take time. But try not to view every step outside of your comfort zone as too risky, as so risky that, you know, if you think about it, that old rule about my life is not filled with anger about the chances I took. It's about the chances I didn't take. And so don't allow the capacity of our minds to generate negative fantasies. I mean, you know, what if I get on that? What if I make a fool of myself, or I do this or do that? Hell, you may, but you will learn from it. And you won't make a fool of yourself twice, maybe 3 times. So don't allow your innate sense of comfort to overestimate the risks of taking off and doing something different, or participating in something different. Doesn't mean you won't have your career, but, you know, you'll have something in addition to that. Okay.
Welcome, Governor. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming. If you walk around this campus, and for the people who don't know this, you had a tremendous impact on what this campus looks like, and the investments and decisions that you made during your term on new facilities, new programs. As you look back on that and try to assess it, particularly in these really difficult times for universities, how do you feel about that and the decisions that got made to make those kinds of investments?
Well, you have to accept at the outset that that old business about your vision exceeds your grasp. It's true. I mean, nothing ever turned out quite the way I wanted. And I would say that in general, the university resisted it. I mean, the university president at the time managed to kill the School of Energy Resources to start with. They didn't like the engineering initiative. They didn't like the science initiative because it's an insular place. But I had some great co-conspirators in the legislature, and we just did it. You know, the faculty and a lot of the administration doesn't like what happened at High Bay with Mohammed. On the other hand, it's one of the most successful things on the campus. So you end up, in terms of physical structure, I think we did a good job. What I worry about is that the quality of programming and the outreach is not necessarily commensurate. You know, that old saying about, you know, that thing about, you know, give me something to match my mountains, you know, about Wyoming. Sometimes I think we need a greater degree of aspiration from the administrations to match the facilities that we have. I know that's not a popular position. But it's what I believe. And I think that the course of the university, the sort of multiple cycles of presidents, declining support from the legislature, which is extremely dangerous for an institution that relies on the legislature for 40% of its base budget, plus a whole bunch of grant things that the legislature funds. That I think, and I hope, I mean, I don't know what the Board of Trustees is going to do, but they need to find somebody who can talk to Wyoming and who can inspire people and encourage, particularly the younger faculty who are trying to build a career, encourage them to do that, because there are a lot of really bright people on this campus. But bright people need to be nurtured, and I'm not sure we have that environment. I'm sure that'll get me in trouble, but you know, I think I can prove it. Maybe not beyond a reasonable doubt, but I'm not U.S. attorney anymore, so my standard's not beyond a reasonable doubt. And I don't think she liked my answer because she's cutting me off.
Thank you. Please join me in giving Governor Freudenthal a round of applause.